Hi, welcome to Table Talks. I'm Pastor Adam.
And I'm Pastor Kori, and we are really excited today to have with us Dr. Sarah Jean Barton. She is a theologian and occupational therapist with a Doctor of Theology degree from Duke, as well as her occupational training done at Boston University. And Dr. Barton, if you'd like us to refer to two, she has a lot of interest around theology and disability and researches that in collaboration with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as bioethics, liturgy, and occupational engagement in religious activities. She currently newly serves just this past summer. That's correct?
Yeah.
Yes, appointed as the assistant professor of occupational therapy and theological ethics at Duke University. And that's a dual appointment at Duke Divinity as well as Duke School of Medicine. So, Dr. Barton, we are thrilled to have you with us, and your expertise and the work that you're doing, we're just really impressed with. So thank you for sharing this time with us.
Thanks so much for the invitation, and invite everyone to just call me Sarah. That's great.
Well, Sarah, we're glad that you are giving us a little bit of your time today, and just tell us a little bit about your scholarship and how you decided to pursue your work.
Sure. So, like Kori said, I kind of have this interesting dual vocation of being a Christian theologian and ethicist, but also working clinically. And I still work clinically even now, alongside being a professor as a pediatric OT. And I've had a long time interest in theology in the Bible, all the way back to elementary, junior high, and high school. Into college, I took a lot of courses. So I was always really interested in just learning more, being active in the church. But when I became an OT, I started to notice that a lot of families I was working with and clients, also worked at the VA, so I worked with veterans for a while. I noticed that a lot of people had some really difficult experiences with their faith communities, and especially Christian faith communities. So I heard a lot of really heartbreaking stories about folks who were asked to leave faith communities because they were too disruptive, who weren't allowed to take part in things like Holy Communion or a confirmation class, or sometimes even people who were denied baptism in certain churches
Wow.
because of their disability. And so that really kind of lit me up. I got really mad about it, actually. And it also really helped me focus on something that was a real world problem. I mean, I love being in the library and reading books, and but for me, theology is something that needs to respond to the wounds and the hardships that God's people are experiencing, and that leads God's people into flourishing. And so I took kind of all these questions and experiences from people that I was working with, sometimes years at a time. And I took those questions and explored them with people with disabilities and their families, as well as kind of in the academic side, and see what have theologians said about this? What is the church? What's the church's tradition in responding to people with impairment and disability? And how can we do better? How can we confess and repent and be renewed by the Spirit's work in us?
Wow.
And so my specific work is actually around baptism and thinking about baptismal identity as a primary identity for all of us as Christians, whether or not we experience disability, and kind of renewing that at the center of our life together. So thinking about, church members who might have a disability, helping churches not think about them first as someone who is disabled, and that kind of being their primary identity, like they need help, they have a deficit, but instead thinking about, we are all disciples of Jesus. We are all baptized into a ministry, whether that's lay or ordained or whatever the Spirit is up to, and really listening carefully, being curious about how God is moving among all of God's disciples, and really supporting that in the church. So that's what I've been researching kind of academically, but then also really in the trenches, so to speak, in faith communities.
Wow.
Well, and this might surprise folks, but this area of theological exploration is like relatively new in a lot of ways, and your research is cutting edge, and your faculty position is brand new. So why do you think this area of study is just now being integrated into theological education?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kori. I think part of it is more and more people with disabilities are coming into theological education, which is also something I'm really interested in, is creating academic institutions that are open to people of all abilities. So I actually taught a course at Duke with Dr. Warren Kinghorn a couple years ago, and we had community members with intellectual disabilities who were students in our course alongside divinity students. And then, so I think more traditional seminarians are coming into divinity schools and seminaries, folks who have maybe a mobility impairment, mobility disability, people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people with visual impairments. And so I think it's a great thing, because theological education is seeing the need to support these folks' call to ministry. Of course, a lot of these folks are having really significant challenges, and I think they're kind of leading the way in pushing these areas, both churches and then schools, to make room for their gifts. I also think it's kind of late to the game, because if we look at the history of disability rights, it's kind of the last, it's a much more recent kind of social movement. So we think about the civil rights movement, the disability rights movement really came after that. And the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law just in 1990. So 30 years ago, which is, it's very recent. And so I think folks are still kind of waking up to the sense that disability is actually the largest, people with disabilities are the largest minority population. And I think people are speaking up and saying, hey, we're here, and our disabilities don't mean that we should only be relegated to certain roles in society, or that we can't do certain things. So I think it's really the strength of the community. I think it's a more recent kind of development in terms of people's rights in our country, and that's a very fascinating history, which I won't get into today and bore everyone. But then also just folks who are coming to be formed for ministry. And I think lay people too who are being formed for ministry. I'm also a lay leader in the Episcopal Church. And I think it's wonderful that there's kind of been a renewal of, we all have a baptismal ministry. We all are following Jesus. Let's figure out how to help each other embrace our gifts.
Well, and as you mentioned that you're a lay leader in the Episcopal Church, how does this work translate to the local church? How can churches and pastors apply a lot of the work that you're doing within our own congregations?
Yeah, that's the question everyone always wants to ask. I'll tell a story actually from kind of my research. For my research, I did a lot of interviewing with people all over North Carolina from all kinds of different Christian traditions and denominations. And it was on this theme of baptism. But one thing that really impacted me, which I'd never seen before getting to know folks around the state and talking to them about how their churches had welcomed people with disabilities and really practiced their faith in ways that were welcoming to all sorts of people with all sorts of differences, that at times had been kind of neglected, I think, or excluded from certain parts of church life. And so one church I was working with some folks at and attending and doing interviews, they started talking to me about this amazing practice they have about baptismal witness and thinking about baptismal testimony. And for me, like, I had always thought about baptismal testimony, at summer camp, you might get up and give your testimony, or churches that baptize, people who can talk and who are older. They might give their testimony of discipleship and their story of faith before they're baptized. But because I'm from a tradition where, babies and people of all ages are baptized, I wasn't as familiar. And this church community, they write, as a community, they write testimonies of people's baptismal ministry and just ministry in their midst. every year on their baptismal anniversaries. And they do this for people who are young and old. And they also do it for people who don't speak. So they have a ministry that doesn't involve, proclamation in the ways that we might think about someone preaching or someone reading scripture in our Sunday services or giving a message in youth group. But this congregation thought it was really important to get to know people enough that they could write a story, a brief story, that celebrated what God was up to in the lives of everyone who is at their church. So like I said, it's not just about, we only need to do this for people with disabilities, but it became this incredibly beautiful thing that also held the church kind of accountable to say, oh gosh, we don't know this person that well. I wonder if they're feeling excluded. Like, I wonder if they're not feeling like they can give their gifts and participate in ministry to the fullest extent. And so that's a story and a practice that I was just really struck by and continue to think about and continue to tell folks about, because I think it's a wonderful way to celebrate, the anniversary of people's baptisms and just to celebrate who people are. And that's definitely in contrast to a lot of churches I work with. I do consulting kind of around the country at this point, and a lot of people will come to me and be like, oh, this person's so disruptive, like we can't handle it, we're going to have to kick them out of the church. And so coming at it not from a deficit perspective, and this goes again for anyone with any kind of challenge, disability or not, and instead shifting to a strengths perspective and a perspective that, hey, this person is primarily a follower of Jesus. How can we welcome them? How are they a prophet in our midst? And that's a practice that I just love, being responsive to how people are creatively showing up and showing God's love. I also think there are really kind of just first step practices that a lot of communities and churches could embrace. There's this thing called universal design for learning, which is this principle that the more ways we have to access activities we do together, so worship is a great example, the more ways we have for people to enter in and to respond, the richer that experience is going to be for everyone. We use all our senses, we're not just brains. And so if we can provide those experiences and pathways for participation and for access in our churches, it's going to be all the much better for everyone involved. And so if you Google universal design for learning, there's a really awesome article that's called Places to Start by Jay Dalmage and his colleagues, and he's a disability studies scholar. And I love how the article is framed. It's free, you can see it. It's like a giant list of bullet points. And it says, just start with one thing. You don't have to start by forming a formal disability ministry committee and raising all this money for it. You can start with one thing that's going to make a difference in your church community. Would it be helpful to have large print? Would it be helpful to brainstorm about having a ramp or rearranging the seating so people could be more comfortable and have a higher degree of access to worship activities? So that's what I encourage churches to do on a practical front, is just start with one thing that is already a need in your community, and you will figure it out together. I'm a big believer in collaboration and communities embracing these things together as kind of groups or subcommittees. I know Methodists love committees. My husband is a United Methodist pastor, and figuring it out together instead of just saying, oh, this one person or this family that's affected by disability, they just have to figure it out. This is really something that can enrich our life of discipleship together. And so we can embrace it, and we don't have to do this huge overhaul of everything, but just start with one practice and go from there.
That's beautiful. I was reminded of a few years ago, I took a team to visit several churches around Orlando, and we met with the staff of one congregation that had started a special ministry for people with different needs. And they did it because someone within the congregation, they had obviously a family member, and so they did it with that purpose in mind. And it just was amazing the way that just seeing someone, as you said, first as a follower, a disciple of Jesus Christ, that's a beautiful way. And oh, that we would look at all in that way. But that church did a function with their group at a local park one day, and there was a family that happened to be visiting that same park with their children, and they inquired about what this group was and what was going on, and so someone had the opportunity to give witness to it. And that family broke down in tears as they were recounting this story to us about having gone to church after church and not being welcomed and being told that they were not welcomed. And they made a commute across the city of Orlando to this other church, a drive of over 45 minutes, I remember them telling us. And because it was a place that they had been able to find as home. And so, oh, wonder how many churches they had to drive past to be able to find that place of home.
Yeah. Wow, that's an amazing story.
Well, I know that this question has probably been raised many times in many conversations, but we are curious, all the richness that you've shared with us. How has our current, season of pandemic and COVID-19, how has that impacted or affected or, kind of made your scholarship or your work shift in ways? You said you're a consultant, so I wonder, when you're consulting church, how does this factor into the conversation? How has this changed your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of our work has shifted in enormous ways. Consulting, it's still pretty nice, meeting with people over Zoom. And that really kind of opens up access to a lot of different geographical places that I wouldn't necessarily have gone before or prioritized before. So I'm still definitely chatting with folks about just brainstorming and learning more about what their community's needs are, especially around any congregants who live with disability or families affected by disability. I think it's a really interesting phenomenon kind of in relationship to a lot of folks I know with disabilities. And I mean, my work is primarily with folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but a lot of my friends have, mobility impairments, or maybe they have a medical condition that kind of makes them not have as much energy as some other folks might have. And so getting physically to church on Sunday is a lot harder for one of my friends who deals with fatigue and is a wheelchair user and has to use like this transportation system that they have to wait on literally for hours at the beginning before they get to church, and then hours on the other end. And so having these virtual platforms for fellowship, for worship, for participating together, even though we're apart, I think has been incredibly powerful for a lot of families and individuals who live with disability. Because I think a lot of these individuals might have been asking for this. I know a lot of people who have asked for this for a long time. The same goes for virtual work. And all of a sudden, when it's affecting everyone, we're like, oh, sure, like we just have to make it work. And I think we've been given a gift that says, wow, we can really engage and reach a lot of people who, even after the pandemic is over, we go back to quote unquote normal, like they're still going to have, their life is such and their gifts are such that a virtual platform might be something really important for us to sustain. So I can't name the number of people for who that's been huge. It's also been, a little painful, or a lot painful for some of my friends who are disabled and have suddenly been much more included because they said, why didn't we do this before? Why didn't the church pay attention to what we were saying? We're the experts on this. We're teaching you all how to do virtual engagement. But I do think also, just like non-disabled people, I think it's been just an increased period of loneliness. And so thinking creatively about how we can foster these connections, especially for folks who maybe live in a group home or a place that has restrictions around who can visit. A lot of times people with disabilities, people with and without disabilities, have a chronic health condition that makes them immunocompromised. And so I think it's a great challenge to us right now too. And it's a challenge to my scholarship to think through, okay, how can we not just focus on like safely and slowly coming back together, but how can we think about sustaining some of these creative ways of fellowship and of connecting with folks long after COVID is over, and really integrate it into our life of worship and fellowship together. So those are some things that I've been thinking about a lot over the past few months. So yeah.
Well, you said earlier that you would encourage churches that they don't have to come up with a whole plan all at once to at least just do one thing. And that virtual option is a great thing for us all to keep in mind. And so with that in mind, just can you think of any other ideas or ways that we might challenge the people of faith to be able to engage in this work?
Yeah. I have a lot of ideas, so people are always welcome to follow up with me. And especially if anyone likes books, I have a ton of books. I'll name one right now, which I think is just a super accessible and kind of groundbreaking book. It's by an author named Eric Carter, and it's called Including People with Disabilities in Faith Communities. So pretty much about what it says it's about. It's a lot of kind of like checklists and like basic activities. I really love it as an OT. I'm a very practically oriented person, and they talk about everything from worship and kind of sacraments and more formal rites of the church, how we talk about confirmation, how we can, welcome people with disabilities into churches doing weddings and funerals. But then it also talks about education and formation, children, but also adults, and then community engagement. And so it's a great book. It's a super easy read. It's affordable on Amazon or your local bookstore if you want to keep them afloat during these times. And it's a great place to start if you're interested in these questions. It's also a great place to start for getting like that one idea for that one need that your congregation really feels like is important. There are a lot of resources out there on the internet, and I say this because I've written some of them. And one story about a resource that I wrote, which was about including, if you Google my name and say like including people with intellectual disabilities in faith communities, I made like a top 10 list. And I think it's a pretty good list, and I still recommend it to people. But when I kind of put it on my Facebook, say, oh, I wrote this thing, what do y'all think? I had friends of mine who have intellectual disabilities, and I had parents of children with disabilities of all different kinds, and actually friends with different kinds of disability, not necessarily intellectual and developmental. And they said, Sarah, you didn't put on the list asking people with disabilities what they need to flourish in a faith community. And I was a little bit horrified, but I also, received their correction and want to kind of exhort faith communities to do that work. Sometimes we're so focused on like making this beautiful program, or like doing these architectural changes, or making a large print, or getting people involved and kind of coaching them and being an usher or doing a reading, that we forget that the people who are the experts on their life experience are these people and their loved ones. Yep. And they've had a lifetime's experience of navigating all sorts of different ways of doing things, and they know what works best for them. They know, what they need in terms of support. So I definitely have to say, I encourage everyone, ask folks with disabilities, ask families who are supporting a loved one what they need, and bring them to the table as an equal partner, and as someone who's an expert and who is in ministry with us. I mean, it's not about ministry to people with disabilities. It's ministry with, and hopefully even led by people with disabilities. I think that's still an aspiration and a hope in a lot of churches. But I think it's something that's not far out of reach. And if we just remember that people are first disciples, and that the Holy Spirit is working in them, let's talk about that. You know, even with people who don't talk, and if you hang out with them for long enough, you can learn a lot about someone. There's a lot of nonverbal communication, and of course working with, you know, loved ones and family and friends who know them. So those would be a couple resources, and then just a general principle. I mean, talk to folks themselves, and you might be surprised at what they prioritize or what kind of asks or supports they need. And oftentimes it's like, oh, this is so doable. Why didn't we ask 5 or 10 years ago? And that's not a shame thing. That's just a beautiful thing about working together as a community, and thinking about access as something that is beautiful and is going to enrich our communities of faith, and not something that's like this burden that has to be done.
Yeah, that is beautiful. And if you have more resources, if you can shoot those to us, and we'll be able to include those in the notes
Great.
when we share this with the congregation. But
Sure.
that is, I love your statement. Go to them, ask them. They know their life experience better than anyone else, and so that shows that we see value in them and in their opinion, their words, and their work. So thank
Absolutely.
thank you so much for your time today. We're so grateful to have this opportunity to connect and uh, to learn and be challenged ourselves. So, Pastor Kori, any final questions or comments?
I just love that, you know, when you say things we could have been doing 5 or 10 years ago, but we just didn't have the imagination for it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of our churches still, they're kind of in survival mode in a lot of ways. And so imagination is a luxury. And, you know, and in this current crisis that we have, it's forced creativity in the ways that, you know, it can open our imagination. I think is just, I know that this is loving people with disabilities and partnering with them is something that's really important to our local church. And so I hope that us talking about it will like you say, fire us up even more and make us talk about this and have that imagination to build God's kingdom in new ways. So thank you.
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me.
And this has been a delight. Thank you so much. And thanks for everybody that's been watching this week's Table Talks. Have a great week.